Hi, I'm Pierce Webb from P-Web Studios, and today we just found out that John F. Kennedy just released an address talking about a Cuban Missile Crisis, and that video is here.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles capable of traveling more than twice as far and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba, while the necessary air bases are being prepared.
All right, as you can see, this is a really big problem and could lead into nuclear war. But I'm gonna send it over to Anthony on the ground.
The reason how the U.S. found out about the Cuban Missile Crisis is because a plane was flying over Cuba accidentally and discovered missiles. As a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. government had made a blockade around Cuba so we could protect our citizens.
Right here is a map showing the naval ships where to blockade around Cuba.
While the U.S. was blockading Cuba, we were also planting nuclear missiles in Turkey.
Did the Cuban Missile Crisis ever get resolved?
Yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis did get resolved by the Soviet Union agrees to remove their nuclear missiles from Cuba.
All right, I'm here with Zachary Hayes. Zach, how do you feel about the missile crisis?
Well, I don't think it's good. It's putting our family in danger and our country in danger.
Unbeknownst to the Americans, the first missile site in Cuba is now operational and can launch on 5 hours' notice.
One regiment was made combat ready on the 20th. Because of equipment delays, our regiment was not ready until the 25th.
In the Caribbean, the tension in the Soviet submarines is fed by an eerie radio silence.
Radio communication stopped. There was complete radio silence. There was no radio communication whatsoever, and that seemed odd to us. We guessed that there was an abnormal situation, but we didn't know what it was.
Shumkov is not in touch with his commanders, but the U.S. Navy is in touch with Shumkov.
We were being hunted by an anti-submarine aircraft. The carrier Essex was blocking us. Its mission was not to let us pass through the defenses. It was a problem without a solution.
In Washington, with the president absent, ExComm reaches consensus. Since a blockade has overtones of the infamous 1948 Soviet blockade of Berlin, Secretary of State Dean Rusk coins the term quarantine. Plans for airstrikes followed by an invasion of Cuba continue to be drawn up. In the meantime, quarantine is a go. Attorney General Robert Kennedy calls the president and suggests he return from Chicago to listen to the ex-com proposals. Pleading a cold, President Kennedy leaves Chicago. Oplan 316 for the invasion of Cuba has been underway for 10 months. But it now has a new immediacy. The timetable is for Marines to land in Cuba just 8 days after air attacks start. Oplan 316 involves 500,000 men, including 40,000 Marines, almost 15,000 paratroopers, 1,000 aircraft, and 180 ships. Elements of the 1st Marine Division leave Camp Pendleton, California, for a voyage through the Panama Canal and into the Caribbean. Tom Brooks was a naval intelligence officer with the task force.
Leaving San Diego was one of great enthusiasm, anxious to go get them. We're going to throw the Soviets out of there and, teach them this is our hemisphere, and we're going to do away with Castro once and for all.
As President Kennedy returns to the White House, he has no idea how many Soviets are in Cuba, and no idea that his troops may be heading toward a nuclear battlefield. On this same day, the CIA notices that at least one of the Soviet ballistic missile regiments in Cuba is ready to fire at any time. Kennedy had wanted any airstrikes to happen before the missiles were ready to fire. That window has now closed. The invasion calls for landings on the northeast and northwest coasts of Cuba, plus a breakout of Marines from Guantanamo Bay to attack what was thought to be 8,000 Soviet soldiers, fighting alongside the Cuban army. But the Soviet troops awaiting them in Cuba are far more numerous than the Americans ever estimated.
There was a great reluctance to believe that there were organized combat units in Cuba, and a reluctance to believe that they would actually engage U.S. forces.
Worse, Oplan 316 does not envision Soviet tactical nuclear weapons.
I hesitate to think even what that would have led to. We were not prepared at all for nuclear combat.
October 22nd, U.S. Navy ships are ordered to enforce a blockade of Cuba, setting the stage for a showdown with the Soviet convoy. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara orders U.S. families and dependents evacuated from Guantanamo Bay and dispatches Marines to reinforce the base. In Havana, Fidel Castro is also preparing for the worst.
At noon on the 22nd, it was announced that Kennedy